The words hung in the vast lecture hall like a decree from the gods, spoken with the unshakable confidence of a scholar who had spent a lifetime dismantling myths. Professor Zalvrith, the foremost authority on interstellar anthropology, clasped his clawed hands behind his back and surveyed the thousands of scholars, officials, and dignitaries before him. The great dome of the Galactic University of Knowledge shimmered overhead, filled with the quiet hum of translation devices converting his words into a dozen alien tongues. He continued, his twin mouths shaping the syllables with practiced precision. The so-called humans that appear in obscure records? Hoaxes. Artifacts of misunderstanding. The result of primitive species inventing stories to explain cosmic anomalies. His dark eyes swept across the assembly. Some nodded in agreement. Others, younglings, perhaps still enthralled by old myths, frowned, hesitant to abandon their fantasies. Zalvrith activated the holodisplay. A spectral projection materialized in the air, a grainy, distorted image of a bipedal figure, humanoid in form but lacking any verifiable origin. Here is the earliest recorded sighting of a human. The supposed Battle of Vorsk's Rift, an unconfirmed conflict from over 12,000 cycles ago. No physical evidence remains, only third-hand accounts from species known for their fabrications. He flicked his wrist. Another image appeared, an ancient warship, charred and abandoned, orbiting a long-dead star. Alien script along its hull was translated simply as "they are watching." A common trick, he explained, turning back to the audience. When primitive empires fall, they invent a bogeyman. Something to blame. Humans have become a convenient explanation for vanished civilizations, unexplained ruins, and gaps in history. But let me be absolutely clear. He paused for effect, his voice lowering. No confirmed biological specimen of Homo sapiens has ever been found. No credible first-hand witnesses exist. No living civilization maintains contact with them. Humanity, if it ever existed, is nothing more than a forgotten fable. A murmur spread through the hall. Some nodded, others whispered among themselves. The weight of his words settled in, as they always did when undeniable logic crushed superstition. Zalvrith allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. This was the truth. It was why he had spent his life in academia, to purge misinformation, to elevate knowledge above folklore. And then, "You sure about that?" The voice was deep, rough, and unmistakably amused. A ripple passed through the audience. Scholars turned, eyes darting to the back of the hall. Zalvrith's throat tightened. A figure stood in the archway, arms crossed. Bipedal. Tall. Broad-shouldered. The translator devices struggled for a moment before settling on a match. Designation, human, one of the university's AIs whispered into the professor's earpiece. The being stepped forward. He wore no grand uniform, no advanced exosuit. Just simple clothing, a dark jacket, a travel-worn shirt, boots that had seen too many planets. And yet, as he strode down the aisle, the sheer weight of his presence sent a chill down Zalvrith's spine. The murmurs swelled into a storm. Some in the audience recoiled. Others activated scanners. Datapads flickered as the university's AI frantically tried to analyze what it had just encountered. Zalvrith's voice was barely a whisper. "Impossible." The figure smirked. His eyes, deep-set and knowing, locked onto Zalvrith's with something terrifying. Something no database or historian had ever accounted for. Certainty. He stopped at the base of the stage, tilting his head. "Go on, Professor," the human said, voice laced with something almost amused. "You were saying?" The hall erupted into chaos. For the first time in his career, Professor Zalvrith was speechless. The lecture hall, once a bastion of intellectual rigor and academic decorum, had descended into chaos. The audience, composed of some of the most brilliant minds in the known galaxy, had no words for what they were seeing. Some fumbled with their datapads, attempting to verify the impossible. Others simply gawked, their alien expressions locked somewhere between terror and disbelief. A human. Here. Alive. Zalvrith forced his twin lungs to draw breath, steadying himself. This had to be some kind of trick. A genetic forgery, perhaps, or a desperate hoax meant to humiliate him. But as the figure stepped forward, the weight of his presence crushed any illusion. His walk was casual but deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. His jacket hung loosely over broad shoulders, the fabric worn but sturdy. There was no sign of augmentation, no cybernetic enhancements, no visible weaponry, just a man who, by all logic, should not exist. The human reached the stage, stopping mere feet from Zalvrith. For a long moment, he simply looked at the professor, expression unreadable. And then, he smirked. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Professor," he said. The translator embedded in Zalvrith's ear worked instantly, but even without it, the meaning was clear. The tone, the cadence, it carried an ease that sent an involuntary shiver through Zalvrith's spine. The audience was still frozen in shock. Then, slowly, the murmurs began. "Is it real? Scan him. Impossible, he can't be." A flicker of motion from the balcony. Zalvrith barely had time to register the raised arm of a security official before a pulse of energy streaked toward the human. A stunning shot, non-lethal, meant to incapacitate. A safeguard. A necessity. Zalvrith didn't know whether to be relieved or horrified. But the human moved. Faster than any unmodified biological entity had a right to. He sidestepped effortlessly, the beam hissing past him and dissipating against the wall behind him. His head tilted slightly toward the balcony, as if only now noticing the shooter. And then, he chuckled. "Well, that's rude." His hand darted into his jacket, and for a single, terrifying moment, Zalvrith thought he might draw a weapon. But instead, the human pulled out a small, round device and tossed it onto the stage. It clattered noisily against the smooth surface before activating. The holographic projection that erupted from it wasn't an attack, it was a data feed. Zalvrith's breath caught. The image was grainy, flickering between static and clarity, but it was unmistakable. A planet. A blue and green world hanging against the void, vibrant, alive. The coordinates appeared beside it, flashing in universal standard. It was Earth. Gasps rippled through the audience. Zalvrith's mind raced. Earth was nothing more than a ghost story, a star system buried beneath layers of forgotten history and false records. This was proof. "You wanted evidence, Professor," the human said, stepping onto the stage. His voice was calm, but beneath it was something else. Something sharp. "Here it is." Zalvrith stared at the image, his carefully constructed reality beginning to fracture. A deep, primal fear crawled up his spine. Because if Earth was real, then everything he had ever believed was a lie. Zalvrith's twin hearts hammered in his chest as the image of Earth flickered in the air before him, an impossible relic from an impossible species. The murmurs in the hall had turned into an uproar. Some were shouting for security to intervene, others demanded further proof, and a few simply sat in stunned silence, their worldviews shattering around them. The human, David Calloway, as the translator eventually identified, stood unmoving, arms crossed, watching Zalvrith with something bordering on amusement. The professor forced himself to breathe. He was a scholar. A scientist. A man of reason. "This is a fabrication," Zalvrith said, his voice steadier than he felt. David raised an eyebrow. "That's a hell of a defense, Professor." "You sure about that?" Before Zalvrith could respond, a deep, synthesized voice cut through the noise. "Cease this disruption immediately." The hall's security forces moved in, their uniforms glinting under the artificial light. Energy batons hummed to life, casting eerie blue glows. David sighed, shaking his head. "I was hoping we could have a civilized discussion first." 2 guards lunged. David moved. He twisted to the side, effortlessly evading the first strike, then snatched the second guard's baton mid-swing. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the weapon clattering to the floor. Before anyone could react, he stepped back, hands raised. "Relax. If I wanted to hurt anyone, I would have done it already." The guards hesitated. The audience was dead silent. Zalvrith forced himself to focus. Think. Restrain him, he ordered, though the command felt hollow in his own mouth. David sighed again. Didn't want to do this. He pressed something on his wrist. The room darkened for a fraction of a second, just enough to throw the sensors into disarray. By the time the emergency lights flickered on, David was gone. Shouts erupted. The security team scrambled. Zalvrith gripped the edge of his podium, his mind racing. Professor. A new voice, low and urgent, whispered through his earpiece. It was not university security. You are to remain where you are. Do not discuss what has happened. Authorities are en route. His blood ran cold. Authorities. Not academic officials. Not the university board. The Coalition Intelligence Bureau. The realization struck him like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just about academic integrity anymore. This was something bigger. Something that had been hidden. And now, something that powerful forces were trying to keep buried. Two armored figures entered the hall, their matte black uniforms starkly different from the university's usual security detail. The crowd silenced as they approached the stage. Professor Zalvrith, one of them said, voice clipped and emotionless. You are to come with us immediately. Zalvrith hesitated. I am in the middle of a lecture. The agent didn't blink. The lecture is over. No debate. No discussion. The weight of authority pressed down on him like a vice. Zalvrith looked at the flickering hologram of Earth, still floating above the stage. If this was a fabrication, why were the most powerful intelligence operatives in the galaxy involved? Why were they so afraid? He swallowed hard and stepped down from the podium. As he walked past the flickering image of humanity's homeworld, a single thought burned in his mind. What else had they been hiding? Professor Zalvrith sat in silence, his tendrils coiling and uncoiling in agitation. The interrogation chamber was stark, its walls a smooth, featureless black. A single light illuminated the cold metal table before him. No windows. No visible doors. The kind of room that made people disappear. Across from him sat a Coalition Intelligence Bureau operative, her uniform crisp, expression unreadable. She had introduced herself as Agent Ralshan, though Zalvrith doubted that was her real name. You were witness to an unauthorized security breach, she began, her voice cold and clipped. This incident is classified under Directive 7. Your cooperation is expected. Zalvrith stiffened. Directive 7. That was the classification reserved for existential threats, planetary security failures, rogue AI outbreaks, war crimes that never made it to the public record. And now, it applied to a lecture? I fail to see how a lone imposter warrants a security classification of that magnitude, Zalvrith said carefully. Agent Ralshan tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Imposter? The word felt wrong even as he said it. He had seen the human with his own eyes, felt the weight of his presence. The image of Earth was still burned into his mind. Ralshan folded her hands. Let me be clear, Professor. What you encountered today was a fabrication, an elaborate deception designed to undermine academic and political stability within the Coalition. You expect me to believe that? Zalvrith asked. I expect you to understand the consequences of believing otherwise. A heavy silence settled between them. Zalvrith was no fool, this wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. A demand for compliance. But something didn't add up. If this truly was a fabrication, they wouldn't need him silenced. They would simply discredit the event, manipulate records, erase it from history as they had likely done to countless other inconvenient truths. But they hadn't. They had locked him away. Because he had seen something real. And they knew it. Where is the human? He asked. Ralshan didn't even blink. There was no human. I saw him. No. You saw an illusion. A well-constructed lie. One that I trust you will not perpetuate. The cold finality in her tone sent a shiver through him. He had spent his life dismantling myths, exposing falsehoods with logic and reason. Now, he was being asked, no, ordered, to do the same. But he knew the truth. And the truth had eyes. A chime echoed through the chamber. Ralston exhaled sharply and tapped a control panel embedded in the table. A projection of scrolling data filled the air, encrypted security feeds, troop movements, containment orders. And a single flashing alert. Subject, David Calloway, status, missing. Not eliminated. Not apprehended. Missing. He had escaped. Zalvrith almost smiled. Ralston noticed the shift in his expression and leaned forward slightly. Do not test the patience of those who control history, Professor. Her voice was softer now. Less commanding, more dangerous. History is written by those who survive it. Zalvrith met her gaze, something deep inside him stirring. He had spent decades lecturing on the fallacies of mythology, the dangers of misinformation. But now, he was faced with something worse, an empire built on silence. Then let's make sure the truth survives. Ralston studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she stood and exited the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. A single question burned in his mind. Where had David Calloway gone? And more importantly, what was he planning next? Zalvrith had spent his life chasing myths only to become part of one. They had released him. Not because they trusted him, but because they knew a professor's credibility could be unraveled with a single well-placed scandal. The Coalition Intelligence Bureau wouldn't need to imprison him. They would let doubt do their work for them. Yet, as he stepped out into the night air of the Galactic University's private docking bay, a single message burned in his mind. Meet me at the coordinates. No security. No witnesses. You want the truth? Come find it. No signature. No traceable origin. But he knew who it was. David Calloway. Zalvrith hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. The journey to the coordinates took him beyond Coalition-controlled space, deep into the outer reaches, territory that the bureaucrats called unregulated. In reality, it was where the forgotten, the outlaws, and the inconvenient gathered. The planet was a dead rock, orbiting a dying star. As Zalvrith descended, his ship's scanners barely registered any life signs. A ruined station stood at the heart of an old mining outpost, its skeletal remains clawing at the sky. He stepped onto the cracked ground, his breathing apparatus filtering out the dust and toxins swirling in the thin atmosphere. Then, he saw him. David Calloway stood atop a collapsed structure, arms folded, watching as the ship touched down. There was something eerily calm about him, as if he had all the time in the universe. Didn't think you'd actually show, David said as Zalvrith approached. I need answers, the professor replied. David smirked. That's what they all say, right before they regret asking. Zalvrith narrowed his eyes. I don't have the luxury of ignorance anymore. David studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Let's get to work. He led Zalvrith inside what remained of the station, past shattered machinery and consoles that had long since gone dark. The deeper they went, the more Zalvrith felt the weight of something buried beneath the surface. David stopped before an ancient vault door, its surface scarred with markings that Zalvrith couldn't decipher. This is it, David said. This is where they tried to erase us. Zalvrith hesitated. Who? David placed his hand against the control panel. A series of ancient mechanisms whirred to life, responding to something only he possessed. The door groaned, then slowly began to open. Everyone. Inside the vault, preserved in time, lay something Zalvrith had never seen outside of forgotten records. A ship. Not just any ship. A warship, human-made, its hull gleaming despite the centuries. The insignia on its side was unmistakable. Terran Confederation. Zalvrith took a step back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. We were never extinct, David murmured. We were erased. Zalvrith's throat tightened. By who? David turned to him, and for the first time, the smirk was gone. By the ones who build your history. Zalvrith's world shattered. The Coalition. The very institution he had dedicated his life to, the scholars, the scientists, the leaders, hadn't just covered up humanity's past. They had been the ones who destroyed it. The professor looked up at the ancient ship, realization settling into his bones. This wasn't just about history. This was about war. Zalvrith stood frozen before the ancient Terran warship, its silent presence suffocating in the darkness of the vault. The smooth metal hull bore the scars of battles long forgotten, yet it still radiated an undeniable aura of power. This ship was not a relic. It was a warning. David Calloway ran a hand along the ship's side, his fingers tracing the faded insignia. He exhaled slowly. They thought they wiped us out. Thought they erased every trace of us from history. But they didn't get everything. Zalvrith swallowed hard. His entire life, his research, his lectures, his certainty, had been built upon a fabricated history. He had spent decades ridiculing the idea of humanity, unknowingly playing into the very system designed to bury them. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David didn't turn around. "Long enough. But knowing isn't enough. It's time to act." Zalvrith's tendrils twitched with unease. "Act? You mean to reveal this to the galaxy?" David finally turned, his expression unreadable. "No. I mean to remind them why they feared us in the first place." A chill ran through Zalvrith. "You can't be serious," he said. "If what you're saying is true, if the Coalition orchestrated the erasure of humanity, then you're dealing with forces beyond your comprehension." David chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Beyond my comprehension? Professor, my people fought wars before half these civilizations even learned to split the atom. The Coalition only exists because they buried us first. But they made one mistake." "And what mistake is that?" David placed his palm against a control panel. The ship rumbled as dormant systems roared back to life. A low, mechanical hum filled the air, growing in intensity. Lights flickered on, illuminating the ship's interior. He turned back to Zalvrith, his expression set in stone. "They didn't bury us deep enough." The realization hit Zalvrith like a physical blow. This wasn't just about revealing the truth. David wasn't planning to be a historian or a whistleblower. He was here to restart a war. Outside, the station trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling as engines that hadn't fired in centuries powered up. Zalvrith took a step back. "If you do this, the entire galaxy will turn on you." David shrugged. "They already have." The professor clenched his jaw. Logic dictated that he should run. That he should report this, warn the Coalition before it was too late. But deep inside, a whisper of doubt clawed at him. The Coalition had lied. They had erased an entire species, rewritten history itself. And he had helped them do it. He looked at David, at the warship that had no right to exist, and felt the full weight of his choice. Truth or silence? History or obedience? The galaxy had spent eons pretending humanity was a myth. Now, they would learn otherwise. Zalvrith exhaled slowly, his mind made up. "What do you need me to do?" David grinned, stepping onto the ship's loading ramp. "Class is back in session, Professor. Let's teach them what they've forgotten." With a final, thunderous roar, the engines ignited. Humanity was no longer a myth. It was a reckoning.